world is changed forever by a new technology, nuclear. Two superpowers dominate the world, each facing the other in a state of neither war nor peace. This is the story of the Cold War, how the push of one button could lead to total global destruction.
Together we shall save our planet, or together we shall perish in its flames.
How the struggle between two political systems caused millions to suffer.
Spying was very much part of the Cold War.
And how a world was created which lived in constant fear. Mad World. Mutually assured destruction. This time on Mad World, both sides are close to turning the world into a wasteland.
The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
He said, all I could think about is you and your sister and your mother were going to be vapor. We all came to grips that it was truly the end of the world as we knew it.
A proxy war spins out of control on the battlefield and at home.
It is an orchestrated lie to make the American people hate the Vietnamese.
The American troops would be impaled on those sharp bamboos in trying to avoid the dummy Viet Cong.
I witnessed the tragedy and the waste of war as well. You don't wish it on anybody.
Both superpowers make moves to extend their control.
For the people of Prague, it must have felt like being the nut in a nutcracker.
Our two peoples tonight hold the future of the world in our hands.
And the USA steps foot on alien ground.
Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, so help me God.
January 1961. Jack Kennedy is the youngest man to become president of the United States. He has a fresh approach to the tension between East and West.
We offer not a pledge, but a request that both sides begin anew the quest for peace. Before the dark powers of destruction engulf all humanity in planned or accidental self-destruction.
In Vienna, Kennedy organizes a private meeting with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev.
Разрешите, господин федеральный президент, поблагодарить вас за теплую встречу, за добрые слова в адрес Советского Союза, нашего народа.
"90 miles from Florida, Castro's Cuba finally provoked the United States to quarantine the island. Aerial films revealed the presence on Cuban soil of offensive Russian nuclear weapons.
Here you had a Soviet outpost with nuclear missiles 90 miles from the US.
The Cold War comes to America's backyard.
I was born in Banes, which is a small sugar town on the eastern edge of Cuba. When the Americans went to the UN with proof of the missiles, many of those photographs were of areas near Banes.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
It was a reckless gamble to which President Kennedy reacted swiftly. He ordered the fleet to turn back or seize ships attempting to augment this aggressive buildup.
Many of the missiles were supposedly driven under cover and so on, But these are huge bloody things, so clearly everyone knew that something was going on.
The Cuban Missile Crisis, the most chilling episode so far of the Cold War.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
And I clearly remember standing at the beach with my parents, and you could see in the distance, in the horizon, grey ships that were American battle cruisers. That's how close it came.
At every air base in the United States, planes of every type are ready to retaliate against any aggression.
Despite Kennedy's warning, Russian Premier Khrushchev continues to ship missiles across the Atlantic with the full support of Cuba's leader.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace, and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. He has an opportunity now to move the world back from the abyss of destruction.
No one knows at the time, but just off the coast, a heated argument kicks off. 3 Soviet submariners have to make a terrible decision.
A US destroyer dropped a depth charge in the vicinity of a Russian submarine. It knocked out the communications of that submarine with Moscow. The protocol that applied at the time for the Russian commander was to use the nuclear-tipped weapon he had on board, the assumption being that if he'd been hurt by enemy action, there must be a war on. So he had the hard decision to make as to what to actually do.
The captain's name is Savitsky. Soviet nuclear protocol dictates 3 senior officers must vote unanimously to launch the nuclear missile. The second in command votes against his captain.
And by a 2-to-1 vote, World War III, I guess, was averted.
The story of a man who saved the world is not revealed until 1998. His name was Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov. An emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council is called.
Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing missiles and sites in Cuba? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no.
But diplomacy is quickly overridden by secrecy and frustration.
You have denied that they exist. I want to know if I've understood you correctly. Prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
As talks break down, nuclear war looks imminent.
Command center was there at Redstone. In those days, there was a bunker in southern Appalachians. Dad went away for 2 or 3 weeks. He said, we had the codes and we were waiting for the order to fire, and there was not a single one of us that weren't convinced that this was going to happen. He says we were literally within minutes of pushing the button. He said, all I could think about is you and your sister and your mother were going to be vapor. We all came to grips that it was truly the end of the world as we knew it. And it was maybe 20 years later before he would even talk about it.
Khrushchev refuses to budge. His missiles are in Cuba in response to a threat from the USA. American nuclear warheads are in Turkey, right next to the Soviet border.
Issue which confronts the Security Council is grave. The hopes of mankind are concentrated in this room.
Frantic talk between both sides continues. Protests seethe on the streets of the West. The outcome is finally determined by one-on-one talks between Premier Khrushchev and President Kennedy.
There is historical evidence of Castro writing to Moscow and urging them to fire the missiles and in effect starting a nuclear war. He's bonkers. I'm telling you, he's absolutely bonkers.
And the deal which Khrushchev wanted to make, if he was to agree not to put missiles to Cuba, was for the Americans to move their missiles from Turkey. It was not in the Americans' interest to embarrass the Soviets too much.
Kennedy reacted correctly to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Had he not addressed it the way he addressed it, quite frankly, against a lot of the military and civil leadership, we may well have had the first nuclear war. And the first nuclear war may well have been the last one, because once it starts, don't know that you can contain it.
The retreat to Moscow. Russian ships steam out from Cuban ports with their decks loaded with missiles the Soviets are withdrawing under pressure from the New World.
The story put out in the press is that Khrushchev has capitulated.
U.S. planes and picket ships have counted 42 rockets on Russian-bound ships.
Kennedy has given some ground too. U.S. missiles are quietly removed from Turkish soil.
They finally cut a deal that, you get the nuclear weapons out of Cuba and quit trying to expand communism in the Western Hemisphere, then we'll take our intermediate range nuclear weapons out of Turkey and we'll all get along for at least for a while.
Both sides save face. History's most dangerous game of poker is over.
This year we were saluting not only the glorious dead of 2 world wars, but giving thanks that the world had drawn back from the brink of disaster over Cuba.
In a small country almost no one has heard of, civil war breaks out. It is about 4,800 miles away from Moscow and almost 9,000 miles from Washington, D.C.
America began her aid program, bringing equipment, weapons, and experience to bolster the South. The Russians and the Chinese gave their support to the North.
Vietnam, August 1964. The people here have already been fighting for 20 years. First, against the Japanese occupation, then against French colonial rule, now against each other.
This year, the Viet Cong struck in larger groups than ever before. When government forces flushed a large communist group, the guerrillas drifted into the jungle to regroup.
I was born in the North, before Vietnam was divided into 2 parts. My parents took us south because they witnessed the cruelty and atrocities. And I grew up in the South. Went to school, medical school, graduated, joined the army.
The communist Viet Cong are close to winning the war.
They have made hit-and-run raids within 4 miles of Saigon, center of U.S. and South Vietnam operations.
Both sides were poor countries, no weapon production. So both sides relied heavily on their allies. The South, the American mostly, and the North communist, Red China, and the Soviet Union at the time.
American troops are not directly involved in the fighting, but American warships hover off the coast.
We do not want Southeast Asia to fall under communist domination.
If South Vietnam succumbs to the North, America thought it may have a domino effect, the first country to fall in a communist expansion across Asia and beyond. Then, a tiny incident in the South China Sea lights a flame.
Reports have been received of a nighttime incident in the Gulf of Tonkin.
We had these boats that we detected on radar, and then we picked them up visually. They're approaching from our starboard quarter. We opened fire. They launched their torpedoes.
The Gulf of Tonkin incident is billed as the first direct attack by the North Vietnamese on the U.S. military. A U.S. aircraft carrier is not far from the Maddox. Robert McNamara, U.S. Secretary of Defense, briefs the press.
They were reporting they were avoiding torpedoes and that they had sunk one of the attacking patrol craft.
No pictures of the attack are released, and the U.S. warships are undamaged.
In view of the unprovoked attacks, the deliberate attacks in international waters on U.S. naval forces, the United States has taken the precaution of moving substantial military reinforcements to Southeast Asia.
Questions hang in the air about the Gulf of Tonkin attack. But the USA finally has a reason to turn its might on the North Vietnamese.
At sea, on land, and in the air, the awesome United States military machine is mounting a force that can face up to any threat.
The USA is now in the front line of the Vietnam War.
From its 4.5-acre flight deck, the American carrier Enterprise can unleash more destructive power than the combined airstrikes of World War II.
When they decided to send troops to Vietnam, it was a very, very bad move because that kind of gave the communists a good, just reason, because there are foreigners there in South Vietnam. Once the war started, and the weapon kept on rolling in by both sides.
We are in Southeast Asia to help our friends preserve their own opportunity to be free of imported terror, of alien assassination managed by the North Vietnam communists.
American troops wait to advance on Viet Cong positions while Sky Raiders prepare the way with their terrifying napalm bombs. This is the hot spot in the Cold War, and this year saw it getting hotter.
Whereas the Americans, because they rely so heavily on their superior firepower, they'll go into battle in the jungle like going into a big picnic. Made a lot of noises. The enemy can smell their aftershave and their Saddam cigarette miles away and avoid clashes.
American casualties quickly rise.
This sergeant was later to die from his wounds because medical helicopters couldn't get through. The Americans can no longer afford to underestimate the power and skill of the Viet Cong. The cost of this conflict is a nightmare balance sheet in lives and money. It's costing America at least $1,000 million every month. At least 170,000 Viet Cong have been killed and nearly 7,000 Americans.
President Johnson is called to account.
Find an answer to their problem there. I believe last week they had the second largest week of casualties that the enemy has ever suffered out there. Their wounded are in excess of, their dead body counts in excess of 10,000. Their wounded is something we estimate more than 3 times that much, and they lose most of their wounded, and we lose less than 1% of ours.
But the greatest death rate is among ordinary farmers and villagers.
Meanwhile, Vietnamese civilians walk hopelessly away from their burning homes. Innocent victims of a dispute too complex for many of them to understand.
And of course, I witnessed the tragedy and the waste of war as well. And you don't wish it on anybody. During the war, collateral damages is always there. You can't avoid hurting civilians. The peasants, the farmers, they are victims of the war. Because they have nowhere to hide, nowhere to run.
The people of North Vietnam are now fiercely anti-American. They are enlisted to help the Viet Cong.
As well as rice, the peasants plant a less palatable crop. The American troops would be impaled on those sharp bamboos in trying to avoid the dummy Viet Cong. Schooling, says the commentator, has to be confined to the night time to avoid the air raids by day. It's hard for the children, the Russian commentary continues, but the day will come when their country will be free and happy.
Future President Richard Nixon does not believe the determination of the North Vietnamese is a serious threat.
We should assume that the war could last 2, 3, or 4 years. Hoping, of course, that by applying more power, we could reduce that below 2 years.
Then American confidence is blown away. The New Year festival of Tet is the biggest holiday in Vietnam, celebrated with flowers and food.
The Tet, which is Vietnamese New Year's, very, very sacred occasion in the Vietnamese culture. So there was a ceasefire agreed on by both sides, but they deliberately violated that.
But in 1968, the Tet holiday is anything but peaceful.
A bloody battle rages in the center of Saigon. The Viet Cong offensive throughout South Vietnam struck at the very heart of the Allied command. It also brought home to all Americans the suicidal determination of their opponents, their ability to infiltrate and conduct a devastating guerrilla campaign.
I was brought down to Saigon to be the deputy commanding officer of the American Forces Radio and TV Network. Was my day job. My night job was special operations, clandestine work. I thought the North Vietnamese were very disciplined, very hardcore, willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of their youth to the idea of reunifying Vietnam. The South Vietnamese were very lovely people. They were very hard fighters once they were trained and given the proper weapons, and very much wanting to be their own country and not dominated by China.
80,000 North Vietnamese troops strike all over the South. But Tet proves a severe blow to the North's hopes. Over 45,000 soldiers are killed. However, it shows that America is not winning. It is a great political victory for the North.
Once again, the plight of the civilian is heartrending. But sympathy is tempered by suspicion. Many thousands of so-called refugees have been arrested on grounds of assisting the communist cause. The death toll of this fearful week of fighting is to been killed. Allied military losses number nearly 1,500.
The USA wakes up to the fact that Vietnam is not going to be an easy war to win. January 1968. One country in Eastern Europe is about to push back against the restrictions behind the Iron Curtain.
I was a little kid. I lived in
Prague suburbs, and I was from a typical family. It was very commanded, very state-controlled, and was centrally planned economy. We had a duty to work. If you didn't work for more than 3 months, you could go to prison for being a parasite of the society. My parents were not communists.
Czechoslovakia has a new party leader with new ideas. Alexander Dubček has challenged hardline communism and won. He puts his reforms into action: a freer market, freedom of movement, and steps towards a multi-party government.
For the people of Prague, it must have felt like being the nut in a nutcracker. To the west, East Germany; to the north, Poland; to the east, Russia herself. A pencil grip of traditional Soviet communism which could shatter all hopes of a more enlightened socialism.
The Russians are not happy. Dubček is summoned to the Politburo in Moscow.
There is going to be this head-on tussle in the Politburo meeting with Mr. Dubček. Is it possible that one outcome of it could be Mr. Dubček's resignation, do you think?
Mr. Dubček is a very sincere and honest man. If he promises something, he keeps his word.
The hopes of the Czech people rest on Dubček's shoulders. He calls his program socialism with a human face. The West call it the Prague Spring. But the Russian noose is already tightening. Huge armies gather on the Czech border.
K té ozbrojené akci může dojít. Nakonec se jednalo o největší vojenskou akci v Evropě po druhé světové válce, takže ty pohyby vojsk byly masivní a samozřejmě Sověti nemohli uhlídat, bych řekl, přípravu tak obrovské operace.
The reform that causes the greatest friction is freedom of the press.
In Vienna, behind a complete security screen, the Russians had restated their demands that the reforming element in the Czech cabinet should be forcibly removed, that censorship of the press should be restored.
But just supposing the Russian pressure from the Politburo is so great that Mr. Dubček does give in and say to them, okay, we will have censorship back. What then would be the reaction of Czech journalists?
Now, after more than 7 months of free press, they wouldn't like to go back to the old times where when they weren't able to express their own views.
Europe holds its breath, aware of lessons from recent history.
It was this same intransigent attitude which caused the Hungarians to revolt in 1956.
No one wants the bloodshed in Hungary repeated in Czechoslovakia.
Millions of people throughout the communist bloc are desperately trying to persuade the Soviets that it is possible to live by democratic principles and be a good communist as well.
The Prague Spring lasts 8 months.
Suddenly we saw tanks at the end of the street, and we were very excited about it, shouting tanks, tanks, and we were running our tricycles close to the tanks.
Z paměti mě určitě už nevyšumí vzpomínka, kdy nás maminka vlastně 21. srpna ještě za tmy budila se slovy, že začala 3. světová válka. S pláčem, slzy v očích a tím nás budila.
Overnight, 2,000 tanks and 200,000 troops invade.
Russian, Polish, and Hungarian troops carry out their cold-blooded occupation of Czechoslovakia. With repeated appeals for calm from the Czech authorities, the mood of the people was grim and hostile.
My father took the numbers from the building, identification numbers, like, which is red and blue. People are supposed to take down the numbers, the names of the streets and numbers to confuse the occupants.
Demonstrators carried a flag stained by the blood of a patriot in a growing wave of protest. There's been protest all over the world at Russia's brutal act. Resistance, futile though everyone knows it to be, continues. Burning vehicles are pushed into tanks and trucks to set them on fire. Crowds jeer and argue with the blank, uncomprehending faces of the troops they thought were their allies. But defiance is crushed under the tracks of the Russian tanks.
The Soviets claim they have a right to invade under the Brezhnev Doctrine, the right to intervene if any Iron Curtain country moves towards capitalism.
Tempers flare and the Russians start shooting. A nation that has grasped freedom now has it snatched away by naked force.
72 Czechs and Slovaks are killed.
Já mám pocit, že bohužel se to lidi vzali velice rychle. Prakticky do 2 let. Do 2 let bylo v široké veřejnosti posekáno takzvaně.
Dubček is ousted and his reforms are reversed. The Prague Spring is over. Czechoslovakia begins a 20-year stretch of hardline Soviet rule. Communist forces seem to be gaining ground on many fronts, but the USA is about to score a major Cold War victory. The space race. So far, it's 3-0 to the USSR, who have managed to put the first satellite, the first animal, and then the first human into space. The USA is striving for the first man on the moon, but the journey has its ups and downs.
And spacemen of tomorrow, together with life science editor Warren Young, get a taste of the world of weightlessness. Each zero-gravity run lasts for only 15 seconds, but those who have experienced it say that in no gravity, time seems to stretch out, and you gradually do learn to navigate.
At impact, the capsule did not right itself as I had expected it to. That I had an hour to wait for recovery. I inflated the raft and climbed in. The raft was upside down, however. I saw 4 or 5 airplanes circling the area. The next thing I heard was a man calling to me from the water behind the raft. I offered them some food, but they had just had lunch and weren't hungry.
The spacesuited commander about to wait in the capsule at the top of the Redstone rocket. As the rocket soared, cameras inside the capsule recorded Shepard's reactions. The rocket reached over 5,000 miles an hour and a height of 115 miles.
The space race had as much, and perhaps even more, to do with missile superiority than placing, people on the moon. That's the exploration side of it was exciting, but there is absolutely no question that the massive effort was being put in the development of strategic missiles and the weapon systems on those strategic missiles.
In 4 weeks' time, astronauts Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins will attempt the 3-day journey to the moon.
The journey of the astronauts is more than a technical achievement. It is a reaching out of the human spirit. What could bring home to us more the limitations of the human scale than the hauntingly beautiful picture of our Earth seen from the moon? When the first man stands on the moon, every American will stand taller because of what he has done.
On July 20th, 1969, two members of the human race set foot on a rock in outer space.
Neil and Buzz, the President of the United States is in his office now and would like to say a few words to you. Over.
That would be an honor.
Go ahead, Mr. President. This is Houston out.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. I just can't tell you how proud we all are. For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives. Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world. And as you talk to us from the Sea of Tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to Earth.
I knew a lot of these guys. You know, I grew up with them. I mean, it takes a special kind of person to place oneself in harm's way in that manner. And all of them did it, whether they were cosmonauts or astronauts. Heroes.
And now, the first man to set foot on the moon, Neil Armstrong.
The strategic importance of the United States being the first to put a person on the moon, I truly believe cannot be understated how important that was.
The USA is finally ahead in the race to explore space. It is a landmark in human endeavor. It is also a foothold into the future battleground of the Cold War.
The United States has been fighting the Vietnamese people longer than anyone else in its entire history.
September 1969, the United Nations. Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko replies to President Nixon's latest request for peace talks.
We pride ourselves on the fact that the Soviet Union's assistance is multiplying the capabilities of free Vietnam in its arduous and heroic struggle.
The war in Vietnam has been unremitting for 4 years.
On a political settlement of the Vietnam problem are presently underway in Paris. To think that the United States can obtain at the conference table what it failed to achieve with a 500,000 strong army on the battlefield would mean to be obviously at variance with reality.
More talks were held in Paris with the North Vietnamese, but the dialogue was hardly meaningful. It appeared as if the only thing each side was prepared to accept was the virtual surrender of the other.
If there was no superpower involved on both sides, perhaps if there is any war, it's on a small scale.
Talks are not making any progress, and neither is the war on the ground.
In a similar position to this to the south, we were 2 weeks almost in the same position. Just couldn't go. Maybe took 500 or 600 casualties before we even gained an inch.
We really only have two choices open to us if we want to end this war. I can order an immediate precipitate withdrawal of all Americans from Vietnam without regard to the effects of that action. Or we can persist in our search for a just peace.
Hopes for a breakthrough rest with the new president of the USA, Richard Milhous Nixon.
Mr. Prime Minister, our two peoples tonight hold the future of the world in our hands.
Nixon's definition of a just peace requires the North to allow South Vietnam to remain free of communism. He believes there is only one way to get that commitment.
I ordered the bombing of North Vietnam and the mining of Haiphong.
3 bombers dropped 60 tons of high explosive. It arrived simultaneously in an area 1 kilometer wide and 2 kilometers long.
It sounds irrational to me that in a free society, the President of the United States would sit in a room alone and make a decision that might bring on World War III without so much as even consulting the leaders or the members of the Congress of the United States.
It is not the easy way. It is the right way. It is a plan which will end the war and serve the cause of peace, not just in Vietnam, but in the Pacific and in the world.
During the period from December 26 to January 1st, U.S. Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps air crews flew more than 650 tactical airstrikes, and the Air Force flew 126 B-52 missions against military targets in North Vietnam.
The North Vietnamese are no longer fighting as guerrillas. The North Vietnamese now are in divisional strength. They're on the highways packed with trucks and personnel carriers. They are a logical target, and there are some 48 targets right now that are not covered by aerial protection that B-52s could wipe out.
But the B-52s are also wiping out non-military targets. Troops taken prisoner are shown the horror of their work.
Since being captured and being a prisoner, I have seen some areas that were bombed that were non-military targets.
Mm-hmm. For example?
A hospital and a school.
The bombings stir up protests worldwide.
That the allegations of atrocities committed in Vietnam are hurting our worldwide reputation. But perhaps what is even more important than our image in the world is the conscience of the American people.
This conscience is powerfully expressed by university students across the nation.
Our intent was to make as clear as we could to the President that the present disturbance on campuses was not a minor issue.
We've issued an official call of the National Supervisory Board of the National Student Association calling for a nationwide student strike.
I think the government was worried about them in the sense that they, I don't know that they felt the politics of them were so threatening, but I think people feared riots and things that would happen. I know a young fellow that worked in the unit that I was assigned to in Washington came around a corner and there was a big riot, and they took him out of his car and turned his car over or burned it, and I remember we all chipped in to buy him a new car.
Now, I understand that there has been and continues to be opposition to the war in Vietnam on the campuses and also in the nation. Under no circumstances will I be affected whatever by it.
It was a crazy time. The country was torn apart by how people felt about Vietnam. I can recall a group of students, probably 500 or 1,000, were going to go trash what was called the Cooley Labs at the University of Michigan. And the Cooley Lab had an atomic reactor in it. You know, you can't have students going in tearing up a lab with a reactor.
Tension across the USA is high. Then, students are killed. Kent State University, May the 4th, 1970. The National Guard opens fire on a protest. They fire 67 rounds. 9 students are wounded. 1 is paralyzed for life. 4 of them die.
when you do have a situation of a crowd throwing rocks and the National Guard is called in, that there is always the chance that it will escalate into the kind of a tragedy that happened at Kent State.
Jeffrey Miller, age 20. Allison Krauss, age 19. William Schroeder, age 19. And Sandra Shore, age 20. Two of the students killed were not even involved in the protest.
I saw the pictures of those four youngsters in the Evening Star the day after that tragedy. And I vowed then that we were going to find methods that would be more effective to deal with these problems of violence.
The Kent State University shootings were a real problem with the forces in Vietnam, to the degree that the GIs thought that the American people were against the war, and it was very disheartening to them and led to very low morale and to drug use and to other problems.
The Vietnam War is radicalizing young people.
Too many have died already. Too many from Massachusetts, too many from your states, too many of our young men and too many of theirs. Too many children and too many aged. The time to end the war is now. We must carry that message to every corner of the land.
In the chaos, President Nixon brings down U.S. involvement in the war.
I have decided to reduce the authorized troop ceiling in Vietnam to 484,000 by December 15.
In Vietnam itself, 1970 saw the continuation of the American troop withdrawal and an increasingly important role being assigned to South Vietnam's own army.
Under the newly authorized troop ceiling, a minimum of 60,000 troops will have been withdrawn from Vietnam by December 15.
American military leadership, much of it from here at West Point, has been superb. I am grateful that only a small number of this class has orders for Vietnam.
The mass bombings and international protests continue for 3 more years. There seems to be no end to the madness.
All of the senators, hardly without exception, and I know of no exceptions, have been trying to get information. Why the bombing? Why the massive bombing?
It is an orchestrated lie, orchestrated by the Pentagon to make the American people hate the Vietnamese.
We're here representing a newly formed American anti-war movement organization called the Indochina Peace Campaign, with the immediate focus of putting pressure on the Nixon administration to sign the 9-point peace agreement.
In more than 30 years of sound and fury, more than 3 million dead, wounded or missing. 56,000 dead Americans, 500 Australians, 188,000 South Vietnamese, 900,000 North Vietnamese, 2 million dead and wounded non-combatant civilians.
Finally, in January 1973, peace talks reach a conclusion.
At 12:30 Paris time today, January 23, 1973, the agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam was initialed by Dr. Henry Kissinger on behalf of the United States and Special Advisor Lee Duc Tho on behalf of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam.
This is the American Forces Vietnam Network.
Well, there it is, what the world has been waiting for, an agreement to end the fighting in Vietnam. The President told us the agreement will be signed on Saturday. American troops to come home within 60 days.
It's overdue, long overdue. People are tired of it. They want to get to their homes. They want to get back to the countries, to the farms. I really do. I think it'll last.
The Vietnamese people themselves are strong people, and I think they will be able to get themselves together. I think that we're doing the right thing by letting them give it a chance.
I'm happy for myself, but most of all, I'm happy for the POWs.
Yeah, right on. That's it.
I'm very happy for the POWs.
Out in 60 days.
Oh, I think there'll be a peace for a while. Whether they stick with it, that's up to those people.
Prophetic words. Within 2 years, the terrible suffering in Vietnam will appear pointless. In Episode 5, advances in nuclear technology imperil the world again.
Our two nations now have 5 times more missile warheads than we had just 8 years ago.
You know, tens, hundreds, thousands of systems, any one of which is capable of destroying widespread piece of humanity in the blink of an eye.
And the end of a war is never the end of the suffering.
Nowadays, the bodies are just left there until they're mutilated by animals and the traffic.
As the Cold War conflict spreads to a new continent,
to learn what it is like to be under fire, 3 quivering recruits faced a Kalashnikov rifle.
boys next door become mass murderers.
I went out there basically to get enough money to buy a house.
And the latest nuclear weapon is an invisible killer.
A devilish weapon, basically. Totally inhuman.
Chile, November 1970. An election victory will lead to the violent death of the nation's leader. It begins peacefully. The Chilean people vote in a socialist coalition.
The year saw a unique political development in Latin America. In September, Dr. Salvador Allende was elected president of Chile, the first Marxist head of state on the continent to achieve power by democratic means.
We were so happy because Allende represents a big change in the Chilean society. Well, my position initially was in charge in the south of Chile, the agricultural ministry.
Allende is originally a physician. This is his fourth attempt at winning power. He doesn't waste time turning his country around.
Chile was governed by the oligarchy. And all those governments, they were a puppet from the United States. And they took the natural resource from Chile with the North American companies.
Chile's great open-cast mines produce the largest amount of copper in the world. The three biggest are American-owned.
Chile's Marxist president Salvador Allende nationalized American copper mines. The government also nationalized major banks and large land holdings.
But worst of all for the Americans, Allende is a communist. And Chile is 6,000 kilometers south of the USA. Top secret moves are made in the United States at the highest level.
Nixon said to Kissinger, you must stop the Allende government in any way.
The government policies have failed. The Marxist theory does not work among a free people.
No one knows at the time, but President Nixon is planning to end the rule of the communist government. Washington cuts off credit to Chile.
The International Bank, the Monetary Fund, they closed any help with Chile.
The Chilean economy slowed. Food was scarce. And when anti-government demonstrations occurred, Allende declared a state of emergency and instituted food rationing.
Tension in the country builds.
We didn't have a strong perception of the American influence in Chile at that time. They were talking with different members of the army to convince them the necessity of overthrow the Allende government.
Then the army tries to take over.
You may be able to hear it. The fighting has now erupted in earnest.
Chaos and terror hit the streets of Santiago.
UPI cameraman, television cameraman, Ricardo Correa, was filming a
part of a gun battle from the 11th floor office of the United Press International. Troops on the street saw the reflection of his camera, mistook it for a weapon, and riddled the office with rifle fire.
The attempted coup fails, this time. 6 weeks later, Allende is re-elected as president. But the peace does not last long.
Meanwhile, striking truckers and their families camped out in fields near their idle vehicles. The Army has seized most of the vehicles, but was searching for tow trucks because owner-drivers had flattened tires and removed engine parts.
Documents recently released reveal the USA funded the truck drivers' strike.
Even Allende, I think, he wasn't aware the American government can overthrow him.
Just 5 days after it was formed, President Salvador Allende's cabinet has suffered its first casualty. General Cesar Ruiz quit his transport minister. He also resigned as Air Force commander.
The Chilean economy collapses. The response is cataclysmic.
While watching the Mineta being bombed was just unbelievable. There were 2 bomber pilots, and they'd fly around the building. They flew around our apartment building and bombed the Mineta, and then they'd go around. They went around about 10 times.
I thought will be some resistance, because we don't believe all the army, all the armed force were with the coup. We were wrong.
The military attack on the presidential palace is merciless.
When the gunfire erupted in Chile 12 days ago, when the government of Salvador Allende overthrown, an estimated 350 Americans took shelter in Santiago and other cities.
There was fighting going on between the snipers above us and the military men down below.
So you were caught in the crossfire?
Yeah. After 3 days, men from the Peace Corps came and got us out and escorted us out.
Salvador Allende, he declared war on the middle class, and the middle class fought back. And they killed him.
Within hours of the military coup, Allende is found dead in the Moneda Palace. He dies from a bullet wound to the head. It was probably, but a debate has raged ever since.
Many people say today Allende committed, but the information we received today, Allende was killed for General Palacios.
I personally have no sympathy for Marxism, but the government had been elected by the people, and this is a military coup d'etat.
The military leader is General Augusto Pinochet. Allende had appointed him commander-in-chief of the army only a month earlier.
I will tell you very shortly what has happened en los últimos 10 días. In the last 10 days, the country, atravesada por una honda crisis, was going through a deep crisis.
They broken my house, destroyed my books and everything, and many people from this group were killed, like my dear friend Dr. Hernan Enrique, who were disappeared, and they didn't refuse to give his corpse to his wife.
Pinochet begins 17 years of a brutal military dictatorship. His government will kill over 3,000 people and torture more than 29,000.
It was a terrorist state, They used the power of the guns, and the power of the army to create a silent society.
Communism has been crushed in Chile, but the result is not freedom for the people. The 1970s. The Cold War is accelerating out of control. East and West are pushing even harder for bigger and better nuclear weapons.
The Soviet Union and the United States have accumulated thousands of nuclear weapons. Our two nations now have 5 times more missile warheads than we had just 8 years ago. But we are not 5 times more secure.
The supposedly very, very sophisticated command and control systems in place with both the United States and the Soviet Union really weren't very sophisticated at all, and it's sheer dumb luck that we avoided during the Cold War years, and indeed subsequently, a nuclear weapons catastrophe.
By 1972, the USA has about 26,000 nuclear warheads, and the USSR has about 16,000.
The United States and the Soviet Union are the only two countries that have the capability of a general nuclear war, and therefore the only countries that can end civilized life as we know it.
Ever since they first appeared, nuclear weapons have invariably been regarded as the most dangerous weapons of mass destruction. This is still true, all the more so since the capacity of those weapons is not a constant value. It is growing.
Then start building them in volume. Tens, hundreds, thousands of systems, any one of which is capable of destroying, widespread piece of humanity in the blink of an eye.
Both sides believe the only way to avoid annihilation is to be ahead of the other in destructive power.
Missiles like the Pershing can deliver a nuclear warhead up to 1,600 kilometers. With its accuracy, it can penetrate small, hardened targets or bury itself deep into the ground, creating an earthquake effect. This is the Boeing air-launched cruise missile being loaded into the bomb bay of a B-52. Formerly, this aircraft was the main strategic arm of the American nuclear deterrent. The most advanced element of the missile's construction, a map-reading computer, guides the weapon at ground-hugging height. At this level, the cruise would be difficult to detect in advance, as it would appear on a radar screen to be no larger than many birds.
The Soviets will have an array of warheads with yields on the order of 1 megaton.
Once you have that kind of an advantage, your competitor wants it. So there was really no way to avoid massive effort by both the Western interests and the non-Western interests to possess the capability, and once it's possessed, to improve it.
This is why the Americans say their new weapons are needed. It's the Soviet backfire swing-wing bomber. 70 of these supersonic aircraft and 130 of the Russians' own mobile nuclear missiles, the SS-20, are said to have been deployed in Western Russia this year.
Our political systems couldn't keep up with the technological developments. These were capabilities that were just almost unimaginable, and therefore the political and diplomatic processes, were constantly trying to catch up.
The latest development is one missile with many nuclear warheads, each capable of striking a different target. The Multiple Independently Targeted Re-Entry Vehicle, or MIRV.
The Soviets have successfully demonstrated in flight tests the MIRV capability. There have been 4 ICBMs in development. 2 of them have already been demonstrated with the MIRV capability. We expect that the MIRV capability is likely to be associated with the other 2.
Some of the Russian MIRVs have 38 warheads each.
Just got out of control. It's that simple.
But I would also not underrate the importance to humanity and to our own people of taking constant steps to get the nuclear problem under some discipline.
Both sides have already signed one treaty, SALT I, to freeze ballistic missiles at 1972 levels. But it is not enough. The next treaty aims to put the nuclear war machine in reverse. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty II, or SALT II.
There were moments and periods of real hope during the Cold War that sanity would prevail. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT, in the 70s.
The United States alone cannot lift from the world the terrifying specter of nuclear destruction. We can and will work with others to do so.
There's always been a deep understanding of the horrors associated with nuclear weapons, a deep understanding of their total unacceptability. The trouble is that hasn't stopped gigantic stockpiles of nuclear weapons accumulating. Up to 86,000, I think, was the highest total during the Cold War years.
SALT II talks are given a boost by the new U.S. president.
Well, I've heard great things about you and your service here in Washington.
Thank you very much.
I hope to form a very close relationship with you personally and,
Thank you very much.
and also with Mr. President.
Anatoly Dobrinin, the Soviet ambassador here since the Kennedy days, brought with him a gift of hand-carved Russian dolls as he began an official relationship with his fifth American president.
President Carter's approach to dealing with the Russians was, I'm going to get inside the heads of the Soviet leaders, and I'm persuasive enough and convincing enough that they will see our model is better than theirs.
He was very, very sensible in his understanding of the risks associated with war and nuclear war in particular, and made a pretty significant contribution to moving the game forward.
And we will move this year a step toward our ultimate goal, the elimination of all nuclear weapons from this earth.
More sensible, more humane heads that just did understand the catastrophic risks involved and was very reluctant to engage in the kind of adventurism which was so troubling with some other presidencies.
Leaders on both sides no longer believe that war will be prevented by the fear of mutually assured destruction. The fear grows that despite MAD, someone could still push the button that would start World War III.
There's therefore always a possibility that misunderstandings may lead to confrontation. That's it.
SALT II replaces mutually assured destruction with a new idea, détente.
Thus, we must be clear at the outset on what the term détente entails. It is the search for a more constructive relationship with the Soviet Union.
In Vietnam, after 12 years of superpower proxy war, there is a note of optimism.
For the first time in 12 years, no American military forces are in Vietnam. All of our American POWs are on their way home. The 17 million people of South Vietnam have the right to choose their own government without outside interference. And because of our program of Vietnamization, they have the strength to defend that right. We have prevented the imposition of a communist government by force on South Vietnam.
But President Nixon speaks too soon.
When the supply, the military aids from the United States were cut off in late 1974, the result was inevitable. We couldn't fight with our bare fist.
April 1975. The Viet Cong have crossed the border dividing north and south. The surge towards the capital of South Vietnam begins.
The battle
for control of the roads leading to Saigon are now well underway. The long-awaited Phase 2 of the Communist Spring Offensive has begun. Bodies of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong enemy were left to rot in the streets. Nowadays, the bodies are just left there until they're mutilated by animals and the traffic.
I lived my last days of the war in the front line because I was a medical doctor of a Ranger regiment. They keep on raining on us with their most powerful artillery. And we all have to dig down in the ground and live like rats and in the trenches there. If you press your ears to the ground, you can hear the faint rumbling of enemy tanks in the vicinity, and that scared the hell out of everyone. We were in the hottest spot, and I was captured alive by the enemy. If you are in a starving condition and doing hard labor from dawn to dusk, all you can think of is food. All you can think of is a few minutes rest. They kind of reduce you to animal level, and that's brainwashing.
In only a few days, the communists reached the outskirts of Saigon.
The jets attacked during the rush hour in Saigon when the streets are packed with traffic. Shops, banks and offices were closed, and people began jamming the streets all over again in their hurry to get home.
The international community responds immediately to the invasion.
As foreigners, mostly French and Americans and Germans, rushed to buy tickets for any flight out.
Embassies evacuate their staff.
Obviously, when you pull out of a place like this, there's criticism that you're going out too soon and maybe promoting evacuation panic.
No, I don't think one could be said to be doing that. You've seen for yourself the flood of Americans going out.
Saigon, April the 30th, 8 o'clock. The last American helicopter on the roof of the American embassy prepares to lift off the last of the evacuees fleeing before the advancing communist armies.
Most foreigners manage to escape, but the South Vietnamese are left to their fate.
And for hours after the last departure, scores of people still crowded onto the embassy roof in the vain hope of rescue.
I think these people up here are committing staying up here, but what can you do?
Hundreds scrambled in panic onto any boats they could reach, not caring how they got aboard or what they left behind.
After several failed attempts, finally me and my fiancée, who's my wife now, we escaped together. We knew the danger, but we decided we better either live in freedom together or die together. And it was a very, very treacherous sea journey in a very small boat, 9 meters long, 33 people. And on the boat, you know, you can just touch the water here because it's so overloaded.
The capital of South Vietnam awaits the arrival of the victors.
And then, shortly after midday, came the climax of 30 years of fighting. They were a disciplined force. Among the thousands who arrived, there wasn't a single reported case of theft, drunkenness, or shooting. People who hours earlier had feared for their lives now turned out on the streets to cheer and welcome. The sense of relief in Saigon was almost tangible. Not everyone saw defeat so optimistically. This officer shot himself in front of the soldiers' monument a couple of hours before the communists entered the city.
On the 30th of April, Saigon fell, and the then President Zeng Wen Min capitulated. And tears streamed down my face. I cried silently for my country. It was a very, very powerful feeling of anger, frustration, and hatred for the betrayal of allies.
People will always agree with the word losing, but that's what it was. We lost.
When South Vietnam fell, 7 other countries fell in very rapid succession to communism.
As the first day of peace for 30 years dawned in Vietnam, the banks and some shops remained closed. But in Saigon's markets, it was business as usual. There were, of course, some changes. In the main market, traders were quick to peddle a new line in flags. Hanoi was calling the tune now, and everyone had to march to it.
I think South Vietnam is just a victim in a global chess game.
As the parade of hardware went on, the overriding impression was one of finality, that the communists had established beyond all question a tight and unopposed control over the land and people that had suddenly become theirs.
As one proxy war ends, another is firing up. This one will last 27 years. It will cause just as much death and destruction as Vietnam. 1975, Angola is on the rebound from colonial occupation. The Portuguese have just pulled out.
They just left the freedom movements, had to fend for themselves. It was the survival of the strongest. MPLA then was the one that was strong in Luanda, the capital, and therefore was on hand on the 11th of November, 75, to declare independence.
Power is taken by the popular movement for the liberation of Angola, the MPLA.
The popular movement was born during the 14-year guerrilla campaign against the Portuguese.
The MPLA is communist. It has most popular support and Soviet weaponry.
The Russian BM-21 rocket launcher, devastating weapon in their armory. Each lorry can fire 40 high-explosive rockets, each with a range of 12 miles. To learn what it is like to be under fire, 3 quivering recruits faced a Kalashnikov rifle and a machine gun firing live ammunition.
The Soviet Union itself, could not send its own soldiers there. I think there's a protocol that exists between Moscow and Washington. They themselves physically should not be involved. They send their allies.
The National Liberation Front of Angola, the FNLA, and the National Union for Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, also fight for control.
8 weeks ago, these young men were in the Angolan bush or living in the shanty towns of Angola's cities. Now, after an intensive course of Cuban and Russian instruction, they are set to join the popular movement's 30,000-man army. Soviet Union has sent close to $200 million worth of military equipment to Angola in the last 9 months. Between 5,000 and 7,000 Cuban military forces are in Cuba, are in Angola, and in fact, they seem to be everywhere except in Cuba.
It was again this external issue of what was called the Cold War. This one is support the Marxist, Leninist, and the other one is capitalist, Washington. You had to choose sides. You could not be in Angola now without being for and against. So that was quite traumatic.
There were proxy wars going on all around the place. Angola was another absolutely catastrophic one. In Africa, massive death tolls. We just forget the scale of this sort of stuff that was going on year after year, often accompanied by atrocity crimes and just the worst kind of behavior imaginable.
Those people, they don't know what you're fighting about. They just want to go on with their ordinary life, to go and till the fields, rear their goats and sheep and cattle. They don't know all these big principles about democracy and Marxism.
The USA supports the opposing factions, the FNLA and UNITA.
MPLA is getting more arms, is getting more tanks, is getting more Cuban mercenaries. So we are prepared to meet any offensive against us from the MPLA.
Angola is a very big country, being somewhat in Central Africa, that if the Soviets were able to really create a vassal state in Angola using their troops and Cuban troops, that could be a base from which communism could spread throughout the African continent.
We know that the Soviets have picked one side, and automatically we picked the other. Well, we are on the verge of spending our first $100 million, and might be more than that.
Angola had a lot of fertile grounds, and they had a number of minerals. They did have oil.
Well, Angola was a source of mineral resources and deeply attractive as a war zone between the major powers as a result, neither wanting the other side to get their hands on these kinds of resources.
American support includes money and weapons. The USA also attempts to cover its tracks. They do not send soldiers. They send the means for the anti-government forces to acquire them. The CIA is providing money for the FNLA and UNITA to pay mercenaries.
And this covert is not something that you can report to the US Congress. It's a covert thing. You kill and everyone will say, you terrible atrocities. People burnt alive in their sleep. Oh, terrible people, and so forth. Not knowing that they are funded by the CIA.
To press the point home, some posters showed a mercenary helmet with American dollars pouring from it.
Mercenaries. People who take part in armed conflict in foreign nations for private gain. These guns for hire bulk up the FNLA and UNITA forces.
The term mercenary always has a bit of a bad name as it relates to Angola.
So it's people really, their starting point and their end point is money.
With a huge supply of men and machinery on both sides, the Angolan people are swamped by a massive war.
They were really dangerous times. There were always breaks on the likelihood of the Soviet Union and the United States actually going to the brink and over the brink as against each other. But none of those restraints seem to apply in terms of the benighted masses in Africa and elsewhere who were, pawns in this larger game.
The effects of the Angolan War on the people were very, very bad. It kept the nation in a very impoverished state for a long time. A lot of landmines were put out, a lot of limbs were lost, a lot of people were killed, villages destroyed.
This 10-year-old boy was seriously hurt in the attack on Kahama. His leg has been severed. The civilians have fled. Kahama has been abandoned to the cows and the soldiers.
The people of Angola were really, really suffering, and all the resources were going towards the war effort. Completely what should be going to education, to health, to housing, to road infrastructure, and so forth. The prolonged conflict and the deaths and destruction and so forth, that hurt.
As far as fighting is concerned, for us, the Cubans or the Russians have no right to kill Angolans. I don't prefer anyone. I prefer the Angolans to be left alone so they solve their problems.
The mercenaries have a reputation for brutality. They are also illegal under the Geneva Convention.
There was a number of mercenaries from different countries that went up to fight on both sides, both with the communist forces and the Western-backed forces, and so there were a lot of executions and extrajudicial killings that went on during that period.
If captured, mercenaries are not classified as prisoners of war. They are tried as common criminals.
Luanda, capital of newly independent Angola. The men in the dock are mercenaries. Their leader was Costas Georgiou, who went under the name of Colonel Callan.
All my men, which had captured the so-called mercenaries, and all the rest of my soldiers, which you have captured, were all under my direct command. So any responsibility and any charges against them, okay, they were following my orders. They were just soldiers.
13 men are under trial for their lives. 3 are Americans, and the other 10 are British.
They were paid to fight against the MPLA, the movement which won the Civil War and which now runs Angola. Having been captured in action, they have now been charged with crimes against peace and against Angola.
Barker, do you still maintain that you do not want a British lawyer?
I trust in the Angolan people. I hope to have a fair trial with the Angolan people. I want an Angolan lawyer.
Many of the mercenaries have had no military training prior to joining Callan's army.
Was it really worth all the trouble and all the killing?
Yeah, I'd go back again, yeah.
Why?
To fight communism.
I went out there basically to get enough money to buy a house.
There'd been a total of about 200 British mercenaries involved in the war.
Some of the men on trial were caught by Callan himself and treated as deserters.
Who were you under?
Callan, Commander Callan. He was Commander of the North. He was a nutter.
14 British mercenaries, it's alleged, met their death at Makela. One of them was killed by Callan himself. The others were shot on his orders by a group led by Callan's second-in-command.
He had shot the young soldier. Copeland then took the rejects away, stripped of their uniforms.
And put them into the back of a truck.
And they were driven away.
And the next, really, that anybody heard was a sort of long burst of firing.
Most observers felt that though the death penalty had been asked for, it was unlikely to be carried out on anyone, apart perhaps from Callan.
That's all I want to say, and I don't want to answer no more questions. Okay? No disrespect.
The verdict is guilty. The crimes include murder. The sentences are severe. 9 of the men are given 16 to 30 years in jail. The other 4 get worse. Their leader, Kostas Georgiou, aka Tony Callan, is joined by Andrew Mackenzie, age 25, Derek Barker, age 35, and Daniel Gearhart, age 34. They are sentenced to be shot.
We have appealed to over 10 countries. There's been a direct appeal to President Neto. There has been an appeal through international organizations like the International Red Cross.
The American and British governments talked directly to Angolan President Agostinho Neto.
President Neto himself stated that he would wait before signing the order for execution until he had looked at the world reaction to the death sentence which has been handed down by the tribunal.
Mrs. Gearhart, if you could talk to the Angolan president directly, what would you say to him?
I'd plead clemency for the commuting of his sentence.
10 days later, all 4 convicted mercenaries are lined up to face an MPLA firing squad. Andrew Mackenzie is in a wheelchair as the result of combat injuries. He chooses to stand for his execution. The Angolan War will escalate before it ends. A huge new wave of American and Russian support will fan the flames. The fighting and atrocities will continue until 2002. Amazingly, negotiating teams from the East and West managed to keep the SALT II talks going. Building a relationship between governments that have been opponents for 30 years is not easy.
NATO estimates that the Warsaw Pact has almost 3 times as many battle tanks as the West. The Russian foreign minister argued that there was no imbalance and that NATO and the Warsaw Pact had parity in military strength.
Arguments continue on both sides about the finer points of the treaty.
It does not permit the Soviet Union to build 1 additional modern ballistic missile on submarines above the level of 950 that we agreed upon.
Both sides have developed different nuclear strategies. The USA has focused on missile accuracy, while the USSR has been developing even larger warheads. By now, the world has enough weapons to destroy itself several times over. And there's still no agreement on how to stop the buildup.
We have continued our discussions with the Soviet Union on SALT and other matters.
In March, when I was there, the Soviet Union made a proposal which in concept was worth looking at, though its numbers have not proved acceptable to us.
Just as SALT II is making progress, a chilling headline stops everything. June 1977. A new nuclear weapon is being developed. Lack of communication in government meant that the US president is not told about it. Jimmy Carter finds out when a Washington Post headline flashes across the globe.
The neutron bomb was a development of the thermonuclear weapons, a devilish weapon basically, totally inhuman.
The neutron bomb. Tests have been covertly carried out in Nevada back in 1963. Research continued quietly under Nixon and Ford.
The neutron bomb, when we heard the news of that, I mean, it's the ultimate sort of doomsday weapon in a sense, I suppose, killing people without knocking over buildings.
President Carter defines himself as a peacemaker. But the tank force of the Soviet-controlled Eastern Bloc countries is about 3 times that in Western Europe. Despite the horrific implications, Carter sees the neutron weapon as the only way to stop a Soviet land invasion.
The neutron weapon is designed to be used against massive and perhaps overwhelming tank forces.
You could actually stop an invasion with neutron bombs by killing all the tank crews, all the infantry and everything else, and keeping their tanks and stopping the advance.
The neutron bomb has a small blast range but releases 10 times the amount of lethal radiation. This new weapon has not yet been deployed, but it is already causing unrest.
The Russian foreign minister stated bluntly that NATO's expected decision to station the new nuclear weapons in Western Europe would destroy the basis for negotiations on further disarmament.
Despite international objections, President Carter tries to sell this new weapon to countries in Europe.
Now, we're not building these weapons for ourselves. We're building these weapons for our NATO allies to protect their territory.
Anti-bomb demonstrations flare up all over Europe.
The answer is no decision has been made with respect to the neutron bomb.
Then the game changes. The USSR detonates its own enhanced radiation weapon.
President Carter has made publicly known his postponement of taking a decision on production of those weapons in order to, in the meantime, ask the Soviet Union to respond in kind.
Hastily convened negotiations secure a pledge from the Russians. The public pressure in Europe does not abate. Carter decides to shelve the neutron bomb.
Decision has been taken right now. We think it's a wise one, politically, diplomatically, in the framework of our common desire for arms limitation.
Work on another terrible weapon of the Cold War is stopped, and not a single neutron bomb is sent to Europe. Strategic arms limitation talks have been going on for 7 years. Lack of progress in nuclear disarmament fuels public anger across the West. Finally, in June 1979, there is a breakthrough.
Today, we are on the threshold of signing a strategic arms agreement that achieves our purpose.
Mr. Brezhnev came to Vienna in June to sign SALT II, perhaps the most significant arms limitation agreement since the Second World War.
SALT II sets regulations on many types of missiles, and it commits the USA and the USSR to limit their nuclear weapon systems to 2,400 each. This is a milestone in the Cold War. For 30 years, the world has been accelerating towards a precipice. SALT II has started to apply the brakes.
It will restrain the nuclear arms race. It will lessen the likelihood of nuclear war.